the new guidance comes in 3 parts, and I think for purposes of the presentation today, we're really going to focus on the first 2 pieces. One is the best practices for pension plans and locating missing participants, and then the second is the compliant assistance release, which gives instructions to DOL investigators who are dealing with these investigations. And the first piece of guidance, I think, has gotten somewhat mixed reviews from folks out in the industry. I think it is very, seen as helpful, as Liz said, in getting some firm guide rails out there, but I think also is viewed as raising some potential issues. While the DOL really went out of its way to say that these best practices are just that, just best practices and not requirements, and that the steps that a particular plan takes are really going to depend on the facts and circumstances. I think, we always have a concern that when you have best practices out there, that they could be interpreted more stringently as really what a fiduciary is supposed to be doing in any given circumstances, including both by the DOL in investigations and also by plaintiffs. So I think there are some concerns out there, but overall, I do think it is helpful that at least now we have something in writing from the DOL that applies to both defined contribution plans and defined benefit plans. The guidance here, I think, falls into 4 broad categories. The first 2, I would say, are really focused on stopping problems before they start. So, not waiting until a participant is in pay status, but really having an ongoing process in place to update a participant's contact information and take other steps to make sure that the plan has good data and is kind of keeping track of where participants are, so that when it comes time to make payments to them, they aren't missing. The second piece is to have more effective communication strategies. And I think this has been really a broad focus generally at the DOL and with other regulators to start communicating more clearly what an investor's or plan participants' rights are and what their responsibilities are and how they actually are able to get access to their benefits and what steps they have to take to actually get paid their benefits. The third piece is really focused on the missing participant searches. So if we go back to the FAB from 2014 that Liz referenced earlier, you see a lot of the same steps, like using certified mail, using free and commercial locator services, but the DOL added some new potential steps, and some of them I think people have cited as being somewhat problematic. So for example, using social media, publishing a list of missing participants on the firm intranet. Those types of steps I think are maybe helpful in some circumstances, but I think also raise some potential privacy issues and the potential for fraud and identity theft that I don't think the DOL really adequately addressed in putting that piece of guidance out there. And then the last piece is to document procedures and actions. And I think this kind of goes to our core ERISA fiduciary duty, that fiduciaries are supposed to have prudent procedures and go through a prudent process. As always, documentation is going to be kind of key to defending the actions that you take. When you look at the best practices and you kind of do an analysis as to what makes sense for your plan, you really want to document that decision-making process. And if you decide not to adopt a best practice, consider putting it in writing why you made a decision not to do that.
Yeah, I think Lindsay did a really nice job of sort of framing how the first piece of guidance comes to us. Again, as the name suggests, it's the DOL's view of what best practices are. It's not officially a set of requirements, but it's a set of suggestions. And as Lindsay indicated, we probably think that fiduciaries looking at this will want to go through each of the steps suggested by the DOL, consider whether they make sense for the particular plan, or if it's a service provider or a service provider, and then document why or why not those steps are applied. The second set of guidance, though, is fashioned as instructions to DOL investigators that are conducting the investigations that I mentioned. But we, actually think this guidance has some relevance, even circling back to that best practices framework, because even for plans and service providers that are not in investigation, if you look at this second set of guidance, there are some suggestions that could come out of it about additional best practice steps. And so for purposes of today's presentation, that's what we want to focus on with respect to this guidance. So I think moving on to the next slide, you'll see in this guidance to investigators, although, it talks a lot about what's the purpose of these investigations, what should the investigators be looking for. It identifies things that the DOL views could suggest problems or more specifically breaches of fiduciary duty. And these are the things that I think could be used almost like a checklist similar to the best practices. So what do I mean here? So for example, the DOL identifies that things like systemic errors in the data, inadequate procedures for identifying who in the plan is missing, inadequate procedures for outreach, and inadequate procedures for addressing uncashed checks. So again, although this is about the investigations, it provides a framework for the big picture issues that fiduciaries may want to be considering. And then there are specific examples. So in the instruction to investigators, the DOL identifies things that they think would be red flags. So one of them is continuing to deliver communications to known bad addresses. So I would translate that into, hey, plan fiduciaries, if you have this process of continuing to send mail to addresses you know are bad, you may want to consider doing away with that because the DOL has cited it as a red flag. Similarly, this example at the very bottom of the page, if there is very clearly flawed data, so birth dates such as 1/1/1900 or names such as Jane Doe and John Doe. So I know from my experience with working with plans and service providers that those are often just placeholders, but I think what the DOL is saying is if you have a lot of placeholders like that, you may want to consider putting those lines of data through even higher scrutiny of searches and outreach efforts. Again, for our purposes, the key point in this data is it could provide another set of suggestions for designing an ongoing administration program. And so I think then we can move one more slide to the third set of guidance, because we're not going to spend time on this today. We just want to identify that it's out there. And essentially, what the third set of guidance is a temporary non-enforcement policy that allows, that signals that the DOL is not going to bring an enforcement against fiduciaries of terminating defined contribution plans or QTAs of abandoned plans that use certain available relief, namely the PBGC's Expanded Missing Participant Program.